and down season as a Red Raider, but will his third season end up being his last? We'll discuss that, including much more on TJ, coming up on today's Locked On Texas Tech.
Are Locked On Texas Tech, your daily podcast on the Texas Tech Red Raiders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Texas Tech podcast, a member of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Be sure that you subscribe to our channel. If you have not already, we are very, very close to 300 subscribers. Thank you to everyone that has subscribed already, and let's get to 300 by the next episode. I know that Red Raider Nation can do it, and so let's see it. I'm Ryan Manville. I cover Texas Tech for the Dallas Morning News. I'm joined by Emery Lida, a longtime Texas Tech analyst, writer, and podcaster. Today, we are talking TJ Shannon. In my mind, one of the most polarizing Tech basketball players, really of the last decade that I can really think of. Came into the season with very high expectations. Obviously, I think in a lot of people's minds didn't really have the season that they expected, but it was a very interesting season, a junior year for TJ Shannon, to say the least.
Yeah, I think really the best way to look at TJ's season and kind of set the stage for it is to look at the last 2 years prior to coming in. And his freshman year really kind of burst onto the scene, started a fair bit of games at the start of the season, kind of faded down the stretch, supposedly had some attitude issues, was in the doghouse. That's kind of the rhetoric that was always used. And obviously there was a lot of speculation, as well as dealing with a recurring back injury, which, spoiler alert, continued to plague him. And then would he be able to effectively shoot would he be able to improve his ball handling and playmaking? And he did that to some degree, but there were still weaknesses involved. And so for me, if I'm looking at the way that TJ evolved coming into this year, I think there was a lot of expectation for him to take that next step, to be the main guy for this Tech offense and really be the leading scorer, be the guy that can sort of lead a team to the Elite Eight, to the second weekend of a tournament. And I don't think that was necessarily a fair expectation placed on him, because the way I looked at it was a lot easier for him to improve the jump shot and sort of improve as a catch and shoot guy, a guy that kind of can be a ball handler in low volume, than to take that next step and be the lead ball handler to take pull up jumpers. And so I think some of it was unfair expectations, but certainly, I mean, he came into the season with a lot of expectations around him and was really looked to be the leader of this team heading into the year.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he was kind of the guy that everybody was watching last offseason, and had to wait a while for him to make his decision about what he was going to do with the NBA draft. Obviously withdrawals, maybe a little bit late, maybe some things happened in the draft process. He has to miss the first couple of games of the season, and then he comes back and he just goes on an absolute tear, and he looks like he is going to fill that role as the best player on this team, as a guy who's going to lead you into the tournament, be your top scorer. And then the injury strikes, and it's just kind of inconsistencies and downhill from there. I mean, you had a couple of rough games early in Big 12 play, but nothing too striking or too worrisome. And then the injury, and he really struggled to put it together consistently from there. But I think if we're going to take a look at the positives, because I feel like that's only fair to do with TJ, because I think that a lot of people overlook the development and just focus on kind of his weaknesses as a player. But I think you also have to remember how far he came. I mean, this is a guy that shot 35 threes his freshman year and made 9 of them. He made 33 this season. So he made almost as many threes as he attempted as a freshman. The development in the jump shot is otherworldly. I mean, it was so necessary for this team, even when, maybe it wasn't at the level that you thought it could be. He still shot 38.5% from deep this year. I mean, that's good for, I think, your second best three-point shooter on the team. So you really needed his shooting at times. I think you saw it late in the Big 12 stretch and even in the Big 12 tournament that his shooting ability was really unlike anybody else's on the team. But obviously, I know that the inconsistencies with his offensive play are what a lot of people will point to as kind of the leading cause of a quote unquote disappointing season.
Yeah, it's really important to remember just how good of a shooter he was at the end of the season. And I feel like that's going to get maybe overlooked. But he was at 31% as a three-point shooter heading into the game against Baylor. And then from that point on, he essentially shot over 45% from three, but into the season shooting 57% in his last 5 games of the year. His three-point shot looked really good off the catch and shoot down the stretch of the season. And I mean, if we're looking at positives, I think he looks so much more comfortable as a catch and shoot player than he did as a freshman and even as a sophomore. Like the consistency that he had down the stretch from long range is something that we haven't really seen from him. And unfortunately, it kind of was offset a little bit by the fact that he kind of took a step back in the mid-range area. His pull-ups weren't what they were the last 2 years, and certainly that was an issue. And then also, I mean, you just have to look at it from a rhythm standpoint. Like when TJ was on over the course of the season, he was really good. I mean, the game against Montana State in the tournament, obviously we'll get into individual performances, but that stood out to me where the first 10 minutes of that game, he looked like by a long shot the best player on the court and getting anything and everything he wanted. And you saw it in Big 12 play as well. It wasn't like it was necessarily limited to the opponent. Like he had certain games against good tier competition where he looked really good for stretches, and then other games where it just wasn't happening for him. And I think the big thing for me is the health, because I look at the stretch when he came back after the NCAA question marks and before the back injury really flared up. And I think you could make a really good argument that that was the best stretch of basketball he played all year. I mean, you look at how he did against a team like Providence, even though they lost that game and even though he kind of had a rough game from three, he was able to create just about whatever shot he wanted in that game. You look at what he did against Tennessee, really the only source of offense for Tech in that one. And you just saw a player that was showing a lot of flashes as a ball handler. And then the back injury happened. And I really think from that point onwards, he just never was the same. Like he had games where he would kind of rekindle that magic. And certainly the shot developing down the stretch helped him a lot and sort of braced the numbers a little bit. But on the offensive end, I think it hampered his ability to drive. He didn't have the same burst consistently. You would see it pop up in some games, and then other games after a little while, it would look like it would fade again. And then as well as I think defensively, it took a toll on him as well. So he's clearly playing through a lot. And I feel like that's going to be one of the more underrated stories with him over the season, because I don't think a lot of people realize that just because he had the back injury in December doesn't mean it didn't linger on for him all the way throughout the rest of the year, arguably.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, specifically mentioning kind of the way that his game had to adapt as he was hurt. I mean, you look at that Providence and Tennessee games, he scored 35 combined points in those two games while going 2 of 12 from deep. That is so far from the TJ Shannon that we saw at the end of the year, who averaged just 8.6 points per game in his final 11 games, but shot 53.6% from deep and 34.1% on twos. I mean, the back injury just took so much gas out of his burst. And it's just so clear. Like last season, watching him play, like every single time the dude got to the rim, it was like he was getting fouled, whether or not he got the call, but he was always making the shot. Like he was one of the best finishers I had watched at the rim through contact, like ever in that 2021 season. This year, you see it against these weak non-conference opponents, Incarnate Word, Omaha, Lamar. Then you see it against high-level competition like Providence and Tennessee, and you're thinking, all right, this is going to be a guy that can put the ball on the floor and get to the basket. The back injury happens, and he's just never the same player, man. So I think it's a really good point by you to bring that up and to remember that, because I do think that that's kind of the inflection point of TJ Shannon's career as we know it, what was dealing with that back injury. And I think that really the entire narrative about who he is as a player and where he could end up changed in that moment whenever he kind of lost that ability to get to the rim.
Yeah, and it really is a reflection point for me, because I look back on his freshman year and I start to realize that when things went downhill at the end of the season, it was very much a similar sort of tendency, except he didn't have the 3-point ability that kind of offset his issues finishing at the rim and ability to get to the rim. Like, I mean, you want to talk about a guy that through the first 20 or so games of that season, his free throw rate was absolutely nuts, like over 65%. He was consistently having games where he would get to the line 8, 9 times. Certainly had a game against West Virginia where he took 14 of them. And then down the stretch of that season where supposedly he had the back injury, you saw a similar thing. And this season, he had the catch and shoot ability that kind of masked a little bit of the production issues. And obviously, I mean, it was still notable. But I mean, it's kind of a little bit, it's a shame because when fully healthy, TJ has probably the best burst on the team. And we saw that. We saw against Tennessee, he was able to consistently create his own shot against some really athletic defenders. Against Providence, he did really well. And I mean, I don't think it would be in every game he's that efficient type of situation, but certainly, I mean, it took a lot out of him. And it's a shame we really never got to see the fully healthy TJ after December.
We'll touch on some of the individual games that he played this season, but first, a quick word from Built Bar. This is the time of year that I've pretty much given up on all my New Year's resolutions, but not this year. I'm sticking to my resolution to eat right thanks to Built Bar. It almost feels like it's not a resolution because I actually enjoy eating Built Bar products. They're not just a protein bar, they're a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. They're low in calorie, high in protein. Replace your candy bars with these, they are better. Go to Built.com and scroll down the macros chart, you'll be blown away. They're high in protein, low in calorie, high in fiber, low in carb. Go to Built.com today to get your hands on some of your own. Thanks again for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. Just a reminder that we are free and available on all platforms. Here talking TJ Shannon, trying to think about some of his noteworthy games in his junior year. Emory, I think it's worth just taking ourselves back to those first 5 games of the season and just seeing a player that felt like he was built in a lab. Like, I remember watching these first 5 games that TJ Shannon played this season and just thinking that, man, this guy is going to be all Big 12. He's going to be in the running for some late season awards, and he's going to be one of the best players in the conference and maybe even in the country. I mean, over those 5 games, averaged 17 points per game, 47% from the field, 37% from deep, 85% from the line, 3.5 boards, 2.2 assists, 1.2 steals. As you watched that early TJ Shannon, what were you kind of thinking in your head about the trajectory of this team and also him as an individual player?
Well, first off, the trajectory of the team at the time, I felt like Bryson Williams was the bigger issue. And we touched on this on yesterday's pod, but there were pressing issues with him. And if anything, I thought he was the guy we were going to have to be worried about from a consistency standpoint and standing out in Big 12 play. But in terms of what TJ did, I really think he just had massive evolution in multiple parts of his game. I mean, the ball handling was really good compared to what we'd seen last year. He showed a lot more flashes as a passer. People have brought up selfish TJ since then, but I really didn't see it in those games. I felt like there were maybe a couple times where the ball was sticking. He was trying to create his own shot too hard, but he also had really high-level reads that weren't really present on film when I looked back at last season, and certainly not in 2020. And you add in the flexibility and ability that he has at the rim. His ability to get to the free throw line was showcased in those games. His mid-range was looking pretty good. And then obviously the 3 was obviously in the bye games, it's hard to get a good read because they were pretty much all uncontested. But even in the Tennessee and the Providence games, even though he didn't shoot them well, he was able to get to spots effectively. And aside from one shot at the end of the Providence game, I really felt like had good shot selection. So it really felt like a mature, composed effort. He's getting to the rim well. He was making good plays. Everything seemed normal. He seemed like by a mile the best player on this team, at least offensively. And, I felt like he was exactly what we wanted him to be preseason, a guy that could be the number one option, the guy that could really kind of lead this team in offensive production and kind of be the go-to guy.
Yeah, I mean, it was just crazy what we were watching. It felt like he had kind of evolved in all the areas that he needed to and was on track to have a really dominant season. And then things obviously begin to wind down as he gets injured. Is there any specific game that you can remember where you began to worry a little bit that the TJ Shannon that we saw at the beginning of the season was probably not going to be the TJ Shannon that we consistently got for the remainder of the year. I have one game specifically in mind for myself. I'm wondering what you think.
Well, first off, I think missing about 8 games from a back injury is something that for me that was a red flag point. Like at that point, I was like, even if he comes back, like guys don't suddenly re-heal their back that quickly. And if it's an injury that's serious enough for him to miss a full month of action, it's probably something that's going to take a while for him to get back to full strength. But then after that, I think the first couple of games were acceptable. We had a good game against West Virginia. But I really think that game against Kansas and Lawrence is sort of the one tip of the iceberg. And I know that a lot of people harped on his decision making in that game, but if you go back and watch it, he was just not himself. He wasn't able to get by guys from a burst standpoint. His efficiency at the rim wasn't there. He was having to settle for contested jumpers because of it. And I mean, that was the first sign for me after 3 games where he supposedly had his ability to get his legs back under him. I just felt like at that point it was going to be difficult to see, at least in the remainder of the Big 12 season, that he would be able to get back healthy again. And then I guess the second game for me that really kind of stood out was just looking into like the Oklahoma games the Oklahoma game late in the season at home, and then kind of that stretch from Oklahoma to Oklahoma State, where even when it started, it looked like he was starting to get better again. He still was having to rely so much on his outside shot. But for me, I mean, it was really the game against Kansas on the road was the one that really sort of highlighted the struggles, and for me made it seem like it would be a long process to get him back to fully healthy.
Yeah, that Kansas game at Fall Gallon was the one I had in mind. And it was really, really deflating to, I think, come to that conclusion because, I mean, you mentioned it. 2 days before that, he scored a season high. I mean, he scored 23 points against West Virginia in pretty convincing fashion. Like, he looked like a really good player, played a lot of minutes that night, shot the ball very well, got to the free throw line a lot. I mean, he looked good. And then, you play him for 36 minutes in Fall Gallon, and he goes 1 of 10 from the field, 0 of 5 from deep, and he gets 3 fouls, playing on the defensive end. And so I think that was the game where I was kind of like, maybe tap the brakes a little bit on expectations and what we're going to truly get out of him this year, because it just felt like that was kind of the game where I just saw that there were going to be consistent issues. And then I think he got things back on track pretty considerably in a 3-game stretch against TCU, Baylor, and Oklahoma. Even that Oklahoma game that was really bad, I thought that he looked okay, especially for just playing 17 minutes. But then the Texas game in Austin, I think that he had some really good flashes on the offensive end in terms of playmaking, and I thought that he rebounded the ball really well in that game. I don't want to say that he didn't contribute, because he did, and he did a lot of valuable things for Texas Tech that night. But to go 0 of 6 from the field, it was just not the performance you need from a guy like that on such a pivotal night. And so I think that game was kind of where I just began to be like, all right, I guess we just buckle in and see what happens at this point. All right, well, we can talk about where TJ Shannon may be headed from here, if he's going to continue to be a Red Raider, or if he is headed to play college basketball elsewhere. We will get into that in our next segment. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand that their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home, and you'll save time and money when you use Rock Auto. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourself customers for over 20 years. Rock Auto's prices are reliably low for every customer. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com. All right, TJ Shannon, I think made some noise this offseason when he decided to enter the transfer portal less than 24 hours after Texas Tech's loss to Duke, which ended their season. It feels crazy, but we're in a position now where it's not far-fetched for us to be talking about a potential return for Texas Tech on this podcast, at least as an option. It did not seem that was going to be the case a few weeks ago whenever he initially announced his decision, but all signs point towards the likelihood of that just continuing to rise. Emery, how have you felt over the past couple of weeks about the possibility of TJ Shannon returning, and kind of where do you stand now?
Confused is maybe the best way to describe it. Like, I don't know. After a day or so, after hearing that he basically announced his intentions to enter the portal before they even got on the flight back from San Francisco, like, it was hard to imagine a player that enters the portal that quickly coming back. I mean, because that's something that had to have been premeditated. And so for him to enter that quickly, I thought for sure there'd be no way. Add in the fact that the awkwardness of it, like having to basically come back knowing that you're not going to be on the team, supposedly you'd be exploring options, like that sort of decision and having it happen with the timing that it went with was just really confusing to me. And then over the course of the last few days, things have changed, seemingly. It seems like people have sort of come around to the idea of him potentially coming back, and we've seen that there's sort of been a little bit of a shift on both sides. I feel like TJ's sort of post towards teammates and appreciation, it's hard to read too much into that, but certainly it's not a guy that's just alienated himself from the culture. And you add in sort of some more internal reports about about the fact that it's been sort of open-ended communication. You add in the fact that that there's supposedly going to be interest between the two, and there's avenues for that to be the case. That's not a completely shut door. And I mean, I think it's the more and more this draws out, the better it feels from a possibility standpoint, to a degree. Once you get past a couple of weeks and there's still no movement, then you start wondering, well, is he just going to go elsewhere? But the longer this sits and the longer we keep hearing good things about him potentially coming back, I feel better and better about the odds, especially considering, I mean, we've seen a shift from almost certainly, it felt like everyone that was in the know had the mindset that it would be really unlikely to see him come back, because again, like I mentioned, it seemed like a premeditated move. It seemed very sort of assertive in the way that he entered the portal. But now it seems like Tech has as good of odds of anybody to have TJ Shannon playing for them again next year. And I would argue, just with the way that things have gone down, that at this point, it might even be the most likely option.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of the longer this plays out, I think the better the case for Tech. There are some really good programs that are interested in getting TJ Shannon to play basketball for them next season. I mean, you look at metrics by guys like Evan Maya that rely heavily on stats. You ask national college basketball writers and analysts who they think the best player in the transfer portal is. TJ Shannon is going to be near the top of the list almost everywhere, and he has been. And so, I mean, you're competing with some really good programs. I mentioned Kentucky a couple of episodes back when we first started talking about this. I don't think that they're as hot as they were a few days ago. I still think that Illinois is very heavily involved. And then I think potentially your Tar Heels could be a team that is kind of the sleeper
I've heard they've
here.
reached out to him.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think that those are two incredible basketball programs. Like, Illinois hasn't found consistent success in the tournament, but those are two teams that have found ways to win basketball games really consistently over the past couple of years. And so the more that I think that you can recruit him internally, it's almost like you're trying to make like an internal hire and get this guy to come back. I think the better the case for you is. And again, you have to have some willingness on your end to do that, right? Because you could say, nope, like you kind of fractured this and you just go play basketball elsewhere. We don't want to try and mend this, but it does seem like there's been efforts by both sides to reconcile things, to try and tie up some loose ends, to try and maybe helps some of the awkwardness of news breaking that you're leaving your team before a team flight that you were on. It's a really strange situation. I'm with you. I'm really confused. But I do think that the odds of TJ Shannon being back at Texas Tech continue to rise in my mind. It's such a weird thing to monitor and to cover and to hear things about. But yeah, a lot of good programs in the mix here. And I think that a lot of people are kind of overlooking the impact of his decision to return, because I think a lot of people are really hard on TJ Shannon, and he's not a perfect player by any means. But I think as a Texas Tech fan, and you're willing and allowed to feel however you should want, I don't think that TJ Shannon deciding to come back could ever be viewed as an objectively bad thing.
Yeah, if TJ is healthy, there's always going to be a good argument that he's one of the best players in the Big 12 and arguably one of the best players in the nation. And I don't think that's hyperbole. I mean, if you look at the way that his impact and metric stats compare to a guy like Ochai Agbaji, up until this year, his third year in the program, you can make the argument that he was on the path to really matching what Agbaji was able to do through his 4 years at Kansas. And obviously this year, injuries really kind of ruined what we could see from TJ. But when fully healthy, he's a guy with extreme burst, really good finishing. The shot has clearly developed. His playmaking's continued to develop. And defensively, he's probably one of the 5 best point of attack wing defenders in the nation. And obviously, we didn't see that much this year for a couple of reasons. A, because of the amount of defenders that Tech had on the roster, and B, because TJ was hurt and clearly not himself. But I mean, he's a really talented player. Again, not without faults. You make a good point there. But I think people are going to look at the way that the season went down and kind of look at some of the off the court things and try to overanalyze the body language and all that. And in all honesty, TJ's decision to enter the portal right before the team boarded the plane really didn't do him many favors in that, Will, because there's going to be a lot of people that are going to have a hard time getting over that. But I mean, he's a really talented player. I mean, it's far from a certain thing. When you're recruiting against teams like Illinois, like UNC, like Kentucky, all of them have these various draws. And I will say, if you're looking at something that would be a concern, is the fact that both Illinois and UNC, I would argue, have kind of personal connections with TJ. With UNC, it's the fact that he's apparently good friends with Armando Bacot, and Bacot could potentially be coming back next year. With Illinois, obviously, you have the location, you have the fact that he's close to a couple people on their roster, as well as the fact potential NIL opportunities in his home state. So there's a lot going on there that would be sort of at play. And I mean, Tech's going to have to get out and recruit him. I don't think you can afford to just sit back and hope that he chooses to decide to come back. I think that there's some mending to be involved on both sides, some trust development, and there's also going to be some sort of persuasion going on. But at the same time, I have faith in TJ. I think that at the end of the day, it's something where he's a talented player. If it happens at Tech, which it looks like it could end up happening, it's becoming more and more likely, and that's a great thing. It can only be seen as a good thing for Tech because he's one of the most talented players in the country. He's really going to be a guy that you can fit in a multitude of different roles on your roster, and you can kind of build around him. And I mean, you pair him with a guy like Jalen Tyson on the wing, for example. That's a really versatile and dangerous grouping to have. So, I mean, he's a very talented player. I think it's far from a foregone conclusion that he'll be back, but I'm hopeful with the way things are trending and with the way that he's played over the last couple of years that he can be a really good addition to the team.
We're really nice on this podcast, and I think a lot of that is rooted in the fact that we aren't arrogant jerks who think that we can play Division I basketball. But like, I'll be like candid here. If TJ Shannon does return to Texas Tech, I think that there are a couple of things that he needs to improve upon. One of them being his decision making, specifically in offensive scenarios of taking the ball to the basket and just staying under control, making sure that he is an outlet, making sure that he's taking quality shots at the rim. And then just late game scenarios. I know that there was a lot of talk about the kind of the last second heaves that he made at the end of some games this year. And there are a couple, specifically the Oklahoma State game, that I don't think are to be fairly blamed on him alone. But I do think that there are some where you kind of need to develop a system where he is not just looking for a shot first and foremost there, but rather kind of trying to play within your system and create offense for other people as well. But I think those are really the two things that I'd like to see improve, as well as just a continued increase in his usage as a ball handler, which of course will need some of that decision making to improve. Emory, is there any notes that you think that TJ Shannon can specifically improve on if he comes to Texas Tech?
I think patience on driving is one of the things. He's a really good finisher at the rim, and he's got the burst to get to the rim really well, but he has a tendency, even when he's healthy, to be a little bit out of control and kind of force things a little bit on the drives. And that goes along with decision making to a degree, but I also think it's just patience, because pure passing decision making, when it's not a last second scenario, when it doesn't feel rushed, I think he makes pretty good decisions relative to the rest of the roster. Is it perfect? No, but that's also kind of to be expected for a guy that's never been a natural ball handler. And I do think that that's something that I want to see improve, but that seems kind of implicit. And I guess the one other thing I would say is defensively, if there was more consistency from him, and I know that I've been really praising the defense, but I do think that this year, and it was probably mostly injury related, he did take a pretty massive step back on that end. And I mean, I'm hoping that that's resolved just by getting healthy again, but I do think it's worth keeping as a point of emphasis. And then one last thing, I think more than anything on the last second shots, it's not so much about him looking for others per se, because I think some of that's just a structural fault with Tech's late game offenses. Like, there have been, for every possession that we look at, if you want to look at the end of the Kansas game, the end of the Oklahoma State game, a couple years or last year, the game against Kansas, Sim Levick, where he lost on a last second shot. Like, over half of these plays that people have sort of harped on him for his decision making there, it's been mostly situations where there wasn't really a good alternative for him, and he was the guy that got the ball. And so there wasn't much for him to do. I think the Providence game sticks out like a sore thumb, but we've been over that way back in the day on this podcast. And I mean, I feel like that was more of an isolated situation. So just in general, improving decision making, being a little bit more patient, and hopefully the defense comes back with health is my three main things.
Regardless of what TJ Shannon ends up deciding, I'm sure that we will be back breaking down a very important decision from him soon. Thanks for tuning in to the TJ Shannon season recap. We will have another one up and ready on the feeds for you tomorrow, so be sure that you are subscribed to our feed wherever you get podcasts, and also our YouTube channel. In the meantime, you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow me at rmainvillelbk. You can follow Emory at eraser41, and then you can follow the official Locked On Texas Tech Twitter page at Locked On TTU. In the meantime, thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL Draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow.